Okay. Okay. Thank you all for joining us for this panel, COVID-19 and Youth Futures, which is taking place on the third day of TASA Thematic Week 2021. Just before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting, or most of us are probably meeting, on unceded Aboriginal lands. I'm dialing in from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and wish to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land, elders both past and present. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get into the presentations. A quick note to say that alongside this panel, we do have some other presentations coming up that fall under the Sociology of Youth thematic group that some people may want to check out. So Sarah Williams on the role of hip hop for Sudanese Australian young people will be on tomorrow, the 25th at 11 a.m. And we also have Ben Lohmeyer later tomorrow afternoon at 1:30 presenting on school bullying research and the experiences of being young. So if you would like to attend those, you can register and come along. Some other things, both myself and Paulina Billett as part of the convening group for this thematic group won't be returning next year. So if you have any interest in putting up your hand to be a convener for the Sociology of Youth group, please email Sally and she'll have all the information. We have an excellent lineup today. I'm really excited to hear from everybody, as I'm sure you all are as well. So we have 4 wonderful papers and they are all co-authored. So we've got lots of different voices and expertise in the Zoom room today. We're going to spend 15 minutes for each presentation and follow up with a 5-minute Q&A for each paper. And then at the end, we'll see how much time there is left and hopefully we can have an extended discussion to try and bring some of these papers into conversation as they are all pretty relevant to one another and speak and complement one another. So with that said, we'll start off with the first paper that comes from Steve Roberts and Ben Lyall. I think both of you are here. Yes. From Monash and the University of Melbourne, which is titled Being Passive Won't Really Get You to Where You Want to Be, Young Adult Future Aspirations from a Pandemic Present. So I'll pass it over to Steve and Ben if you want to share your screens or a screen. Okay, great, thanks.
Just checking that my slides are showing up for everybody.
I think so, yeah.
Great, thank you, and thanks Sherene, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Yeah, I'll kick off today's session and today's presentation by just quickly thanking our giant research team that I mentioned on the slide here. I won't run through all of the names, but special shout out to the people that are also on the Zoom today. So Brady Robards, Jonathan Smith, and Patrick Marple as well. And particular shout out to William Lukamto, who can't join us today. He's finishing up his final stages of his PhD, but contributed a lot to some of the statistics that we're going to be sharing today. So this is a very data-driven presentation. We are in the very early stages of analysis of a large project that we conducted in the middle of 2020 and in the middle of COVID. It was a project funded by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and was broadly a study of contemporary youth transitions, but had some very specific public service focuses as well. We won't be talking about those elements of the project today, but if people are interested in seeing some tidbits from that side of the work, I'll just post a link into the chat there for that now. And then I'll move on to some of the context for the presentation here. So we focused the study on people aged between 18 and 30 years of age. And yeah, it wasn't intended to be a particularly COVID-focused study, but that's the way things kind of went last year. So we're drawing on 4 different data sets across the project, but today we're really only speaking to 2 of them. So the bolded couple here. So we've got 47 focus groups, which were featuring 155 young people from around Australia. And those were conducted between March and July. And then we're also discussing the findings of a nationally representative cross-sectional survey, which had 2,261 responses for that same age bracket. And that was administered in August 2020. And accordingly, we'll be talking through some of the findings from this work in that order that the project was conducted as well. All right, I'll pass this over to Steve now, and I'll be back with you to talk about some of the stats from the survey in a moment.
Cheers, Ben. Thank you. So obviously, as usual in these kinds of things, given myself too much to get through, so forgive me when I start to rush. But yeah, I'll start with some slides about the focus group data, and our aim in this part of this of the research was to explore understandings of adulthood and how this compared to different previous generations, I guess, and what kinds of state and familial support and other resources that young people need, use, or expect to make use of. And as part of this, near the start of the focus groups, the participants did an exercise where they would, oh, I've got a different screen. Okay, and participants did this exercise where they would use an online whiteboard and draw a visual representation of life from 18 to 35. So kind of like a timeline that captures both their lived experience and their imagined and expected futures. So we know that this kind of exercise has a long history, including in very influential projects like Rachel Thompson and colleagues inventing adulthood study in the UK at the beginning of the 2000s. And in that work, and as with many studies that have used this method, it's usually an individual reflection, but in our study, because it was focus groups, it was undertaken collectively, or at least simultaneously with other participants. And they were encouraged to do what they wanted in terms of the shape and the representation. Sometimes they mapped out one image and discussed its details, and other times, like the one you can see on the slide now, this was a focus group with regionally located women. They each drew a line and tailored it to themselves somewhat. And there was an occasional loop, like in the bottom one on the slide here, and a kind of squiggly back and forth representation that you'll see on the next slide. But mostly they drew relatively straight lines, and it's possibly easier to document a timeline in this way, but more significantly, most of the people in this research imagine futures that were kind of expected to achieve independent living, usually and often owning a home, full-time work, stable careers, coupledom and parenthood in relatively linear terms, despite everything we know about the way that adulthood has shifted and changed, and at this time of potential great disruption. I think in part this probably reflects that, as again, thinking about what Rachel Thompson tells us, that such activities invite hypothetical reflections informed by, quote, normative understandings of the proper thing to do. And in this case, it might be doubly the case, actually. So in a focus group, young people, even when they're drawing individual timelines, are still co-constructing that imagined future together. So although probably as well, and regardless of whether they drew out a timeline each or whether they drew one altogether, there was plenty of nuance and individual perspective, but still within this kind of broad brush hope for the future that reflects the so-called normal biography. And on this one as well, before I go to the next one, I won't read out the detail, but you'll see there's narration of feelings as well. And when this occurred, it was mostly, like on this slide, in relation to the past, and was much more common among women, but it didn't happen very often. Next slide, please. So I'll quickly go through the next couple of slides, which just give a couple more examples. So this is a group of young men who went with a similar model of a line each, and then notably much more sparse than the young women. But here we see this one guy who was keen to represent a kind of a more risk biography, I suppose, with steps backwards and forward. Next one, please. And then this one, again, just an example. This was a group of non-students who were currently in work. And this is an example of a single line that was co-constructed. And it also includes sources of support. So this is something, as I mentioned, that we asked about, but the role of the state and other information sources wasn't always apparent. In the drawings, at least, it was part of the conversation for nearly everyone. The different colors you can see, I'm not going to talk to them, but they're basically additions that reflect different points of discussion and different priorities. And the main point I want to take from these three images that they all ended up with discussions or depictions of the mid-30s being a time when one should have already achieved or hope to have achieved independence, financial independence, families and houses. So somewhat delayed compared to older generations, but not reflective of a new adulthood in any particular way. Next slide, please. So, okay, getting to some detail of what they said, though, there were, of course, a range of views on whether idealized outcomes were realizable or not. I'm not going to read the quotes, but basically, in the top left, this is a young woman talking about how ever owning a home feels distant and unreachable, but she retains a degree of hope that you can see. And then that hope is stronger still in the bottom left, where this young man is describing how COVID has basically not dented his dream future of a house and a well-paying job. In the top right, again, an emphasis on how the pandemic has not altered plans necessarily for this young man. And then even more kind of amusing in some ways, but it's very serious from her point of view. In the bottom right, COVID is described as being additionally motivating for this young woman who talks about knowing that she has to wait to start earning money, but she can't face living forever with her mum, essentially. So she wants to get to it as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. Okay, so despite this mix, the modal tone was overwhelmingly positive and hopeful, and at times it carried a strong hint, more than a hint, of neoliberal logic. And it's clear in the emphasis on individual effort that you can see in the left-hand box and the yellow box there. So this was a young woman who was successful by lots of measures, home owning and so on. So she really emphasized her own role in making this happen. And her own effort. And then in the pink box, this guy, like many others in the research, framed the crisis as surmountable if one is not passive. And at times the participants strongly encourage one another to take this stance as well. So what you can see in the bottom right-hand side is where one young woman is feeling a creeping doubt that she's being too ambitious to want to buy a house by her mid-20s. But then the other women in the group kind of met this with a, you can do it, Helen, kind of motivational talk. So just quickly reflecting on those, some of those accounts, like, basically sit alongside people like Lawrence Angus's writing about Australian education policy, where he suggests that neoliberal norms and values are shaped and reinforced in the education system, and then also in personal, family, and social imaginaries. But another way of thinking through this is offered in Julia Cook's excellent discussion of hope. So it's nice to see Julia here as well. Her discussion of hope as productive, where among other things, she writes about hope as being both a means of coping with uncertainty and a type of agency. And like Julia's respondents, many of ours imagined a future that could be acted upon and yet was filled with ongoing processes which were already latent in the present. Sorry, that was a quote as well. Okay, next slide. Nearly done. Okay, so moving to a little of the survey data, and Ben will go into the detail a bit more, but we didn't ask about hope specifically, but imagine futures were surfaced through questions on the importance of markers of adulthood and confidence in achieving them. So first of all, as per the top left-hand corner here, the graph shows that of the 1,874 who answered this question about buying a home by age 35, only 18.5% found it unimportant. And among the vast majority who did find it important, which is the graph on the top right-hand side, just 20% were not confident this would happen, and nearly 50% were confident or very confident. And there was also a kind of clear correspondence on other measures between finding something important and the confidence that it will happen by age 35. So as the bottom two graphs show, first of all, for people who thought that a de facto relationship was important by 35, there was a considerable confidence that this would be achieved, but this is nothing compared to the next one, where the confidence among those who wanted a specific but different job to what they have now was just over half of the sample. Over 70% were confident or very confident it would happen, and a further 22% were at least somewhat confident that that would happen. Ben's going to dig into the detail of that a bit more.
Thanks, Steve. So I guess it's important, and as we would know, as sociologists studying in this area, it's important to unpack exactly, who it is we're talking about when we're saying that people have aspirations and hopes for the future and things that they want to achieve in terms of, the kind of material realities of that. So I want to speak very quickly to two aspects of that we uncovered as being significant in the survey data following the focus group work. And those are around mental health and some of the kind of material barriers that COVID was presenting to people in terms of their future aspirations. And as we can see on the slide here, someone names up specifically the connections between financial stability and mental and emotional well-being. So overall, an important kind of picture and a known picture kind of forms here, where people who are kind of faring better in all of those areas are the ones who are, more positive and more hopeful about their goals and aspirations for the future. So these are diving into some of the kind of statistically significant relationships between some of the demographic factors of the research, the survey respondents, and some of these kind of aspiration-focused questions. So I'll very quickly whiz through these ones, but the first slide here is dealing mostly with mental health and related measures. So 40% of our survey respondents reported they had worsened mental health during the pandemic, and 53% reported that they felt lonelier. And then within these mental health measures, we noted that mental health had declined somewhat more for women and had improved somewhat more for men. And then we also found that loneliness was reported as being higher for non-binary gender respondents. We also saw a bit of a relationship between increased loneliness and education levels. So those with higher education were feeling slightly less worse off than those who had lesser qualifications. And we also had a section of the report that was dealing with supports that were being received, such as government payments. And we also saw a bit of a decline there from those who were frequently receiving support in that area. And then to the kind of material kind of impacts of COVID as well, we noted that 24% of our respondents had their work hours reduced, 13.7% had their pay reduced, 12.3% were laid off, 6% of those without pay, and that includes people who were receiving JobKeeper as well. And we saw here that men were more likely to be laid off than women, but women were more likely to be stood down without pay. And we also saw an increase in financial difficulty being experienced by people who were non-native English speakers. And of course, people who were living independently of their parents were experiencing more financial difficulties than those who weren't. So those, as I said, when I started talking before the statistics there, they do paint a kind of familiar picture here in terms of, who it is we talk about when we say that people still have fairly typical kind of goals and aspirations for the future. But just to kind of wrap up, our results here tend to show that rather than corresponding with any ideas of a kind of new adulthood, and despite all of the issues that have been raised by COVID-19, most of the young adults that we spoke to or were featured in our survey imagine their futures in very conventional fashion, with kind of linear understandings for typical markers of transitions to adulthood, even if those were a little bit delayed at times. And these included things like home ownership, partnership formation, getting the kind of jobs and careers they wanted, and parenthood as well. So in this regard, COVID was framed as being more of a blip, and hope kind of prevails through the kind of crisis and is a kind of productive force, as we saw in the discussion between the young women in Steve's slide earlier for the focus groups. We noticed too that even for the older groups of young people, sort of between the ages of 26 and 30, who were potentially a bit cynical about the idea of things like home ownership and made snarky remarks about avocado toast and those type of things, they didn't necessarily frame those concerns as being related to the pandemic. Those were more kind of underlying things that they identified themselves regardless of the COVID situation. So I think important to finish up by saying that, as ever, the aspirations and the potential realization of these are definitely cut by social location and people's differential access to resources. So I'll leave it there and hand over to the Zoom room for any questions for Steve and myself. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Steve. That was great. I didn't mention this earlier, but if you have a question, we aren't going to use the chat function, or you can use the chat function, but I worry that the question might get lost. So in the next 5 minutes that we do have for questions related to this paper, can you just please raise your hand and I'll try to get to you. I think, Julia, you've got your hand raised.
For that, and thank you so much for the paper. I really enjoyed it. Really interesting work. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the potential impact of the stage of the pandemic at which you collected this data set. You mentioned that it was mid-2020. I'm wondering, obviously, as sociologists, we always want to be collecting more data, and it's impossible to answer all of our questions, but I'm wondering if there might be difference in terms of the kind of biographical impact of the pandemic that you identify if you were to speak to the same people again, like this in the middle of 2021, this year. Just speaking from personal experience, in 2020, I was kind of like, okay, we can get through this, and then this year it's been kind of hit more of a wall. I'm wondering if that's something that you've considered, the kind of, not only the kind of social location of the participants, but their location in time within the kind of expanding time range of the pandemic.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really good point. It's difficult to know exactly what they will say. I guess we all have an intuition that they might reflect somewhat differently now, but interestingly, even though it's a different project with a slightly different agenda, we've just done another huge survey that's more about careers, and but we also included a kind of confidence in your ambitions and so on at the beginning. And overwhelmingly, people are still incredibly confident, which is surprising in a way. But I think it talks to your work, Julia, actually. Like, I think it's we need to dig more deeply around that. And we've literally only just got the data back. But there is something about, not writing off the future when there's potential for it to be something that we can act upon, and not being too negative and pessimistic. Otherwise, it gives one nothing to live for, almost. I suspect that's what's going on. But yeah, interestingly, the data that we've got in the new round really supports the idea that people still think of COVID as a blip, especially in the kind of younger 20s, which is surprised us somewhat. I thought they'd be pessimistic and think over the horizon of, post-graduation, things would be really difficult. But actually, there's this kind of we're protected because we're at university, and the ramifications are more for people who are at 23 to 26, say, who are trying to get their foot on the career ladder now. But anyway, I don't doubt that things would be slightly changed, and we're very much capturing a moment, like with much social research, we're capturing an imagined future and a present that was very then, and now is still somewhat different, but overlaid with an understanding that there is still a remarkable amount of confidence in the future.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
I was just going to quickly add, if I can, I think we noticed even just within the data set, because of the length of time at which the data was collected and across the different methodologies, the focus groups, I think, pointed very much to those early stages where some people had immediately been laid off work, and in some states, let's say Victoria, and then you speak to people in Tasmania who hadn't felt the impact at all at that point in time. So there was a lot of variation there. And I think by the time we did the survey, there was probably a little bit more of a flattening out of people's experience towards the negative. I think the mental health stats that we raced through earlier kind of speak to that. But it's definitely a really good point, and it would be fascinating to speak to all the same people again, for sure.
Great. Any other questions? Well, I might just throw one in there if that's okay. I was just wondering, I could sense from the tone of the presentation that both of you were quite surprised by some of the findings around, that this isn't like a new form of young adulthood, but perhaps a temporary pause or a blip. I was just wondering where you anticipated that young people might receive new messages about changing direction or abandoning the old pathway and pursuing something new. Was there a set of people or places or institutions that you thought might be pushing young people along to try and transform what they had been working up to this point?
That's a great question. I think it's a number of things, but actually there's some in the data as well. There's definitely some discussion of people talking about how their friends are on this kind of normative track and they're not. Like, it's a minority part of the data, but you definitely see that kind of social network, the relational kind of really comes to the fore, even at times like parents talking about how, or young people talking about how their parents say times have changed and therefore life won't be so easy, acknowledgement that it's not so easy to get onto the housing ladder and stuff. So I think the sources of that information are there, but they're not as perhaps not as influential as I might have guessed. So both through the media, like all the discussion about avocado toast and all that kind of negative stuff, and that young people push back against, that's there. And I think institutions set people up with an understanding that, for example, the career, like schools and higher education, set people up with an understanding that career change is very normal as well. But even though they talk about that as a possibility, they still kind of reorient themselves to a more kind of linear, same job, same career, get the house by the time you're 30 or 35, get a partner and a family and so on. So there's power in that normative model, despite the fact that these messages that come from both institutions and society at large, I think. I don't know if Ben has anything more on that.
Yeah, I was just going to add too, I think that the word aspirations sometimes can also start to sound very like blue sky thinking and far-flung, but a lot of the stuff we were seeing as well was actually very grounded in experience, and we should give the young people credit for what they contribute in terms of sharing their experiences in this work. And like, there was a really great conversation that we unfortunately had to cut from the slides because it was just too long, but some participants were discussing the fact that they had seen their parent care for their parent during their lifetime and in-home care at an older age. And that was something that they wanted to plan ahead for in terms of having their own home, having security, and preparing to do that kind of caregiving role in the future. So there is some real power behind some of these ideas as well from people's circumstances.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, thank you both so much. That was wonderful. We're going to move on now to a presentation from Brady. I think, Brady, are you the only one giving the talk, or is somebody speaking with you?
Ruby's going to speak.
And Ruby as well. Okay. The presentation is titled "The Impact of COVID-19 on Young LGBTQ+ Young People." Brady's from Monash and Ruby's from the University of Tasmania. So I'll just hand it over to you.
Thanks, Sherene. Can everyone see my slides okay? Yeah, awesome. Yeah, look, thanks so much, Sherene. And this paper ties directly into the paper by Ben and Steve. So that's very useful. Thank you. I don't have to do all that setup. It's from the same project, but in this paper, we're looking specifically at the experiences of LGBTQ+ people compared to their cis and heterosexual peers. I do also want to acknowledge I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to Aboriginal elders and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here today. So this is obviously also part of a big team, a football team, as our funder described it, of researchers, including Steve and Ben, but also Jonathan, who's with us today. And some of the analysis or some of the data we're going to talk about is actually based on a very preliminary analysis that Jonathan did. So kudos to Jonathan, and he can probably answer the methods questions much better than Ruby or I. We are not quantitative sociologists. We're very much qual people, but some of the findings from that we didn't expect in terms of differences between these groups were so stark that we really wanted to talk about them here and dwell on them a little bit, acknowledging that they're limited in terms of the time, the discussion that Julia and Steve and Ben had before about the time that this survey was conducted, but also acknowledging that this wasn't a study about queer and gender diverse young people. It was a general population study, so we didn't have that at the forefront, but the data has really spoken to us in terms of these significant differences. So that's what we want to talk about today. So by way of a little bit of background, we don't want to frame this discussion in doom and gloom terms. Of course, many queer and gender diverse people live happy and productive and joyful lives. But of course, as sociologists interested in inequalities and social patterns, we do have to acknowledge that there's a significant literature, well documented internationally, about inequalities LGBTQ+ people face in a range of different areas. And without rehearsing this in too much detail, I think in Australia, one of the best studies over a long period of time is the private lives studies conducted through La Trobe and Arches in particular, for the last 15 years or so, that has painted a really clear picture in terms of high and very high levels of psychological distress that LGBTQ people face in Australia, significantly higher rates of suicidal ideation and attempts than the general population, high rates of depression and anxiety, and so on. And also I want to acknowledge, by way of background here, that talking about the LGBTQ+ community, it's obviously a very broad subset of experiences that's intersected by a range of other forces around class and race and geographical location and so on. So this isn't a singular experience. There are many experiences here, of course, but the power, I guess, for us in thinking about LGBTQ+ people as a group helps us look at patterns and differences when compared to cis and heterosexual respondents in this study. The other important thing to note here is that there is already some great research looking at the experience of LGBTQ+ people in Australia and more broadly, and looking at the impact of COVID-19 And that's partly why I've teamed up with Ruby on this paper. She and her colleagues have written about especially experiences of Tasmanian queer and gender diverse people, and their impact, the impact on mental health, well-being, and minority stress. And so that invited us to think about what does this mean for young people's futures in terms of education, employment, housing, finances, and so on, in the way that Steve and Ben have hinted at for the general population results previously. So I won't go through this in any detail. As Ben and Steve explained, the project was quite large, which is why we had such a football team of researchers involved. And it was carried out in a very short period of time in the first half of last year. I'm going to be speaking, Ruby and I are going to be speaking mostly about the national survey. We won't go into the other aspects of the data, but we did have focus group data, as Ben and Steve mentioned. We did some secondary analysis led by Jonathan of LSA and Our Labs data. And we also did some social media analysis work as well. So it was quite comprehensive, and we're just going to zoom into this one particular aspect. So first of all, we had a really diverse range of respondents, and I'm obviously focusing on gender and sexuality. We had a number of non-binary respondents. In terms of sexuality, though, one of the most interesting things that stood out for us was the sheer number of queer and gender diverse people who actually responded. We didn't recruit specifically around sexuality or gender diversity. This was a kind of a panel that came to us through Qualtrics. But the number of, especially around not identifying as straight, was quite significant. So more than 20% of our respondents were not straight. But as I said before, we didn't set out to study gender and sexuality per se here. And so the questions we asked about gender do have serious limitations. We didn't ask about gender assigned at birth. We did provide, opportunities for people to describe their gender and sexuality in their own terms. But the extent to which we can talk about trans respondents who identified as male or female is quite limited, but didn't, identify as trans specifically. So that's one caveat in terms of our findings here. This, 20% plus figure raises big questions that I'd love to get into, but we don't have a lot of time. But maybe people can raise this in question time about, are young people more likely to identify as queer these days, or are we just getting better at asking questions about this complexity in surveys and holding space? And I know Brendan is in the room, and Ben Hankel, and we've been working on this in other spaces too. So it would be great to chat about this, but I'm going to hand over to Ruby to talk a bit about some of our data.
Thanks, Brady, and hi, everyone. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm joining you all today from the lands of the Muanina people in Nipaluna, Hobart, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any Indigenous colleagues who are joining us today. So thank you, everyone. And thanks so much to Brady and the team for having me along for the ride on this really interesting project. It was really great to join the team for this talk and for a paper that we're working on around this. So as Brady mentioned before, there's a lot of work that's very well established disparities between heterosexual and non-heterosexual people around mental health. And we do know that these are being exacerbated during COVID-19, as some of my previous research has shown. And so in line with this work, this study, perhaps unsurprisingly, did find that prior to COVID-19, queer young people's self-assessed mental health was lower than heterosexual young people's, and this has only gotten worse since the pandemic. And this is arguably having effects on how queer young people might think about their futures, and particularly some of the issues we want to share with you all in our presentation today. So our findings suggest that COVID-19 is impacting queer young people's educational outcomes and employment opportunities. So most notably, we saw here that queer youth were much more likely to have lost their jobs, to more likely to have been laid off, or the place that they work went out of business.
Turn off the radio.
Can we just get people to mute if they're not on mute and not speaking, please? Thank you.
We also found that queer young people were also significantly more likely to report experiencing disruptions to their studies. So these were two things that were coming through really significantly, these really big differences. And we had a really interesting chat about what might be the causes of this. We did consider whether there was just, and this was something that Brady and I had a really interesting conversation about, whether this was coming from our own perspectives as white middle-class queer people who have been in the university system a long time. Are queer young people just more likely to be at university, so they're more likely to report having disrupted studies because of COVID? But the data doesn't support this at all. We find across this whole data set, we did find very similar rates of full-time and part-time study across everybody, regardless of gender or sexuality. In fact, maybe there was even slightly lower rates, just a little bit for queer people. So this wasn't an issue. We were also thinking about whether queer youth were more likely to report losing work. Are they, perhaps they might be concentrated in more precarious roles or industries that might be more likely to be impacted more severely by COVID. That's something that's interesting that we can't really make any claims about here, but it's something that we'd like to flag for further exploration. So we really think that this increased mental health toll that the pandemic is having on queer young people must be a significant factor here. If you are in a precarious or vulnerable situation already, the best of times, that this is going to impact on your ability to work and study. And then we might be seeing COVID really throwing people over the edge here. In terms of finances, as we've just been discussing, this survey was conducted quite early in the pandemic, so we didn't really see any significant differences in financial impacts at that stage between heterosexual and non-heterosexual young people. But this is certainly something that we'd like to monitor in the future, considering what we know about the income disparities between LGBTQ people and the wider population, but also some of those things that we're seeing there around the impacts in terms of work and education. How might that have flow-on effects further down the line for young people in the future? But some of our most notable findings that we're really interested and excited to share with you from this were looking at how queer young people were the sort of social impacts. And so we're thinking about how queer youth were much more likely than heterosexual youth to have to move back into home with their parents due to the pandemic. We see quite, double the amount there. And this was really statistically significant. So, this might be due to those impacts we're seeing on queer people's work and education during the pandemic. You might have to move back in with mum and dad. But as queer researchers ourselves, reflecting on this, it was interesting to think about how, we know that LGBTQ young people might experience abuse or even violence from unsupportive parents or family members at home. So for this group to be much more likely to have to move back in with those families, this really does raise some concern about the ongoing well-being of this group of people. But it's also important to recognise too that not everybody's parents are assholes. Not everyone has strained family relationships, and so we're thinking about the broader impact that having to move back home might have for young people and young queer people in particular. Moving back in with parents might place people back in the social circles of their family, their extended family friends, possibly moving back into maybe suburban or regional towns, rural areas. And this is taking young people away from their established friendship networks and also perhaps queer spaces that have been really important for people's well-being. So this was a major impact that the pandemic was having. And we could maybe infer that this might be linked to this really significant higher likelihood of queer young people in this survey reporting feeling lonely and isolated during this time. So that's, some concerning findings there, but I want to pass back over to Brady now to tell us the nicer part of this story, that it's not all doom and gloom, and we're really interested to explore some of this a little bit further. Thanks, Brady.
Thanks, Ruby. Yeah, we don't want to make it all negative. Obviously, these are really challenging findings, especially in those 4 areas that Ruby identified, and a really nice link into your previous work, Ruby, that was just published this year in the Journal of Homosexuality. So I think that's a great connection for us. But on a more positive note, one of the really interesting findings that came out of the survey was also that young queer and gender diverse people talked about their social connections increasing online at a more significant rate than heterosexual and cisgender peers. And so this is kind of an interesting positive story about what young queer people can do in terms of leveraging technology. And it's, in some ways, it's unsurprising, right? Like young queer and gender diverse people have always been early adopters of different technologies that facilitate connections and across geographies based on interests. And Nina Wakeford's earlier work on the theorization of cyberqueer has been quite fundamental to some other work that I've done with colleagues, including Ben Hankel, Brendan Churchill, Son Vivian, Paul Byron, in our Scrolling Beyond Binaries work. And I'm also, led here by some work that Ben Hankel and Chandra have done, a report published this year on social media insights from sexuality and gender diverse young people during COVID, in a partnership they've done with some social media platforms. So this is unsurprising, but an interesting, positive caveat, I think. So just to really wrap up, I won't go through these in detail, but the key findings so far, based on a really preliminary analysis, are that there are these a very large number of LGBTQ+ respondents in our general population survey, which is an interesting kind of pattern in terms of the rise of complexity and identification, and also how surveys might open and provide space to queer and gender diverse people to more accurately reflect sexuality and gender identity. But of course, the key thing I think for us is that there were these great unevennesses, even in that early part of the pandemic, in the first part of last year. And, going to thinking about Julia's question again, my hunch is that this has only deepened in some respects, but we would need to do more research, obviously, to figure this out. And also this more positive story about preparing young queer people being more capable of leveraging digital media for connection and even building social capital during this time. So in terms of next steps, Ruby and Pat and I had a discussion the other day about what this might open up. Can COVID be read as sort of queering ideas and assumptions about futures? Could there be productive aspects of this kind of disruption around work disruptions or study disruptions or new imaginings of futures, even though, based on what Steve and Ben are saying, there's still this very much linear, surprisingly optimistic kind of narrative about futures. We need to do more qualitative work, I think, to dig into, how this plays out specifically for queer people. I know that's a great cliche for a qualitative researcher to go through a bunch of survey data and say, oh, we need more qualitative research. But that's, I think, really where it's led us. Cool, I'll shut up now. Thanks so much for everyone to being here.
Thanks, thank you both. We'll just take some quick questions. We've got about 5 minutes. If you have your hand up and I'm not seeing it, can you just jump in?
Can I ask a question? Thank you so much for that paper. I'm just curious about what you have found about our young people becoming queerer, and I suppose I'm speaking from the perspective of a parent, actually, of teenage kids, and noticing that in my daughter's peer group, she's saying, she once said to me, I'm the only straight one left, kind of thing. And this is not my area, so I'm just curious as to whether there has been research done on this, whether you're aware of any of that research, and whether you're going to pursue that, in the qualitative component.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great question, Ruby. I don't know if you want to jump in, or Pat's here as well. There is some really good research emerging around this, and there's been some work in the UK, like this sort of longitudinal YouGov survey that's talked about the rise of sort of Kinsey ones, and young people being much more open about identifying as bisexual or pansexual or mostly straight. So the rise of these kinds of categories, which of course, people have always, had, complex multi-gender, same-sex gender attractions. But I think one of the key challenges that a lot of the literature points to is that the instruments with which we measure sexuality and gender have often been very limited. So in our longer paper, we've got this longer discussion about in Australia, if you try and figure out how many people in Australia are queer, you'll get everything from like 3% to like 20%. And so this points to a real problem with social science methodologies, I think, and something that we're really grappling with here. But yeah, Ruby or Pat, feel free to jump in. Or not, maybe someone else wants to jump in too. Feel free.
I have a question. It's not really following off what Christina asked, sorry. But just on your slide, on the housing and social connection slide, I was curious about two parts of it. The first is the line of questioning around that young people had to move back to their family home. And I was wondering about how that was set up. So was it like did you move back home and then did you have to, or did you want to? Or I'm sure there's something around that. I was just really interested in that I had to component of that response. And then the other part of it, and maybe you already said it and I missed it, is that there was a much higher rate among queer young people of feeling lonely. And I was wondering if that was markedly higher than non-queer young people in the sample, and how that connected to the moving back home part.
Yeah, great question. So in terms of the first part around moving back home, it was in the section of the survey that dealt with the impact of COVID on their sort of situation. So it was more, did you have to move home because of the impact of COVID, losing work, disruptions to study, that sort of stuff. So it was framed in those terms. And then in terms of the second part, what was it again? Oh, about loneliness, yes. Yeah, so this is a really good question, and other people feel free to jump in, Jonathan, Steve, Ben, others. But one of the issues, of course, is that young queer and gender diverse people are starting from a lower base, I suppose, in terms of, or a worse off base in terms of their experiences of loneliness, whether that's because of geographical isolation or sense of connection to community or family, those sorts of things. So yeah, we're working with Barbara Barbos and Neves, who's studying loneliness, and mainly with older generations in relationship to technology. But that's something I think that we're going to have to investigate further about the relationships between those things. Jonathan, I don't know if you looked at any of that or want to jump in.
Yeah, I don't have a particular comment on that. I think there's certainly scope to explore it a little bit further. I did sort of have a criticism of, I can't actually remember exactly which parts of the analysis I worked on. It's been a bit of a blur, but so potentially a criticism on myself, which is, I would like to see, and maybe we could look at this again down the track, just at the possibility of disaggregating the queer sort of group. And I think partly as an initial sort of exploration of the differences, the sample size might have been a factor there to sort of detect any differences, sort of thing. But particularly when we have quite a relatively large group of queer young people, we may be able to sort of look at some splits within that, for instance, around bisexual versus other groups within that, and see if that there are any sort of variations in those sort of impacts, around relationship, but just around the mental health question as well. And other people maybe more like experts in this area, but I do understand that I think, you know, bisexual young people in particular tend to experience higher levels of psychological distress. So that's just in that kind of area. But we're talking about the impacts of COVID though, and so people change. You know, people are impacted in different ways. I think the question about relationships is really interesting, and loneliness, and it'd just be interesting to see if we can pull that apart a bit. So I guess I'll make a note for myself, just to see if maybe that's something we can do.
Yeah, no, this is turning into a bit of like a project team meeting now, but we did do a bit of that with William. And yeah, the issue, of course, is when you drill down into smaller groups, you know, the power gets reduced down. But yeah, that's something that we have on the agenda for the longer paper. And you're right, the kind of difference in terms of location, state, and also bisexual and you know, gender differences between men, women, non-binary people, and so on is also definitely part of that yeah, disaggregating work that we've got to do next. Yeah.
Great, awesome. Okay, so our next paper comes from David Farrugia, Julia Coffey, Julia Cook, and Stephen Threadgold from the University of Newcastle. They are presenting on COVID as a crisis of post-Fordist labour, young hospitality workers. So I'll hand it over to whoever's speaking for the team.
Me.
Yep.
Yes,
okay,
that's me. Okay, hello friends. Let me just share my screen. I assume that's working. Please let me know if this is not a PowerPoint presentation that you're seeing. Okay, very good. Expert zooming once again. Okay, I'm just going to time myself. Good. All right. So hello. Thanks to the organisers of this panel. The papers so far have been really interesting, and I think there are some interesting connections that we can look at as we go on. In this paper, we are wanting to share some work that we have been doing over the last couple of years, looking at the experiences of young hospitality workers in the context of COVID-19. And the context of this was a broader research program which looks at young hospitality workers and some internal money that suddenly couldn't be spent as a result of COVID. So a new project was born. But basically what this project is doing is looking at the way that COVID is, well, I suppose the key argument here is really going to be that COVID as a crisis is enacted through the social relationships of the hospitality industry. And to kind of examine that in the context of, you know, the state of play in work more generally, which we're kind of looking at through the concept of post-Fordism. So we know, of course, that young hospitality workers were hit very hard by the pandemic, due, of course, to their precarity, high levels of informal working arrangements, casualisation, and, of course, the nature of their work as face-to-face interactive labour in the context of a highly infectious virus. But we can also look at this in the context of labour force transformations that have come under the umbrella of a very diverse set of ideas connected with the notion of post-Fordism, which describes a historical moment characterised by labour market informality, labour force heterogeneity, including race and gendered diversity as a critical aspect not only of labour forces, but of the way that labour produces value for employers, and of the significance of embodied and interactive labour for contemporary economies. So the hospitality labour force is, of course, evocative of all of these conditions. It's enormously diverse. It is, you know, high-touch, interactive kind of work, and it's highly precarious. So what this paper is going to try to do is situate the pandemic not just as something that comes and impacts on youth, but rather as a crisis of labour itself, as a socially produced crisis that is enacted through the dynamics of the post-Fordist labour force within the crisis conditions of COVID. I'm being told my internet connection is unstable. I'm sorry if that is the case. I'm just going to continue to cruise on. Okay, so basically, here's the project. You know, we have a context in which, as we all know, government support was tied to working arrangements, length of tenure with employers, and was not offered to international students when the industry shut down. So we went and did a project using qualitative and digital methods in which we did interviews that explored experiences of work, sources of support, family, housing, and well-being. And we also used some digital methods in which many participants posted text, image, or video-based posts on Slack over a period of a couple of weeks to represent their lives and their relationships with work while the industry was closed. Here are our demographics. They were mostly casual and front of house workers, most are students, and we did have a cohort of international students with some very particular experiences. So in the context, I might actually yes, okay, apologies, I'm going to skip this slide because let's just get to the data. So the first thing to say about hospitality workers' experiences of COVID is that immediately the sector is in a position to shut down. And what happens to them is not simply a result of their employment contracts. So workers have a vast range of different contractual situations and structural positions within the labour market. They can be full-time, part-time, casual, or off the books. But that was not the key thing that determined what happened to them. The key thing that determined what happened to them was informal negotiations taking place between themselves, their employers, and other workers, which determined whether or not they held on to their jobs, whether or not they held on to their shifts, and what happened as the industry reopened, because it started to reopen in Newcastle as we were doing this project. So here's a young guy who basically, he's saying we all got interviewed for our financial positions and what we had to pay for. I had moved home at the beginning of the pandemic just because I wasn't sure what was going to happen going forward. I had the least amount of financial commitment, so I put myself up to be made redundant essentially. So with this guy, his boss says to everyone, okay, what do you all need to pay for? You know, who's got kids, mortgage, etc. Okay, you don't have too many financial commitments. Off you go. You no longer have a job. So again, this guy could have had the same contract as kind of other workers. What mattered were these kind of informal negotiations that took place between him and his employer. As the industry started to open up, these kind of informal negotiations mattered even more as people re-entered work and tried to secure some kind of new position for themselves in venues. So here's a young guy who basically describes the way that the hours that he gets now that venues are reopening are dependent on because he has been shifted to a new venue as part of the chain that his employer runs because the old venue wasn't opening. So basically he said, you know, before I came along, they had the venue manager, 3 other managers and a floor member. That was their team. One of their managers is studying to be a paramedic. She's got exams. The venue manager is looking after her staff first. But that means me, I'm also studying for exams. I have to make up for that. And this guy's problem was actually that he had too many hours. There was too many expectations on him. Basically he said, I don't have a choice. I have to work in this new venue. I have to work more than I really want to because the manager's looking out for people that she's already friends with. He basically says, you know, everyone, you know, in hospitality, what matters after can you serve food and drinks is how well do you get along with your manager. Anyone that gets fired from this company, they're going to struggle to get a job anywhere. If you're not on good terms and you're with your manager, you're not going to get the hours that you want. So I just have to kind of deal with it. So again, he's kind of informally negotiating the kind of structural conditions of his work in a kind of interpersonal sense, in a way that doesn't map neatly onto his employment contract or his class background, or his level of skills, or his length of tenure, or anything like that. It's really about what can he put together interpersonally between himself and his employer. And that's really key to Post-Fordism, this kind of informal negotiation of employment relationships underneath what happens with contracts, etc. Here's the same guy saying, you know, I could be getting made redundant and put back on casually. They've kept us on JobKeeper as a sign of good faith. I think I'll get put on casually, work my hours casually. I was full-time, but the structure of the business is going to change entirely from here on out, essentially. So, you know, as he renegotiates his re-entry into employment, his working conditions are going to transform radically in ways that are very unpredictable, but that he will negotiate with his boss. But within these informal negotiations, what we also saw was the emergence of new solidarities amongst workers. and new forms of support that workers were offering one another. Again, solidarities that are poorly recognised in existing understandings of employment, which tends to regard hospitality workers as precarious, atomised, and disempowered. So now, some of these are a little bit dire, just because of the unbelievably desperate situation that some of our participants were in, particularly international students that just had no money and were screwed. But nevertheless, here's a story. So the restaurant Attica, anyone who lives in Melbourne will know about this restaurant. It costs like $500 to eat there, right? So, however, Attica did this thing where they were giving hospitality workers free food. They sort of set up a kind of de facto soup kitchen. These participants were extremely appreciative of that. Attica, of course, had a lot of very expensive groceries they suddenly had nothing to do with. So they were selling that on the cheap. A number of restaurants did that in Melbourne, and we're doing that actually up until recently. So Attica gives free food to hospitality workers. This is an informal thing distributed on social media. It's not kind of advertised in a big thing. So, that is a kind of form of informal support that hospitality workers had available to them as a result of the specific kind of dynamics of the industry. Another thing that happened was that workers started to kind of help each other. So here's a young woman whose best friend, she says, is her manager, and her manager moves in with her during the pandemic for reasons that she didn't want to disclose, but her manager could not keep living at her old house. So she said, she ended up moving in with me during isolation because of her living situation and because we both lived alone. We just thought it was a better option. So I ended up seeing her every other day, which was very lucky. But my other colleagues, we did not see each other. We broke the law a couple of times, visited each other by accident, that kind of thing. So basically, her manager, her workmate, needs support, needs housing. Bang, there she is to kind of help her out. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two is that the way that all of this happened was deeply connected to a range of divisions within this enormously heterogeneous labour force, one of which really critically was gender, but also international student status. So here's a narrative from a young woman. She's also an international student, and she basically loses all of her work straight away, has no money, can't get JobKeeper, is, as I said, in sociological terms, screwed. So she turns to, Seek, Gumtree, things like that. She says, well, I'll just read this out. She said, one time I found a cleaning job, but it was so weird. Man, he was like creepy, I found it online, all my jobs disappeared. How many hours I spent on Seek, sending emails. So this one guy calls me. He was a weirdo though, part of all this, He called me and said, oh, can you come right now? I'll pay for your Uber. I was talking with a friend and saying, oh, this is the address. If I don't tell you anything in 15 minutes, call the police. So she thought, I'm putting myself in danger here, but I need money. And he did actually end up being a weirdo, kept texting her late at night in a kind of creepy way. So, surprise, surprise. Not only that, there were also, and this is going to come as no surprise to anybody, there were also class differences in terms of how people responded to the crisis. But what's interesting about hospitality, in order to understand this, is that we're used to thinking of class as something that roughly maps onto a person's occupation. Right. So, however, the hospitality labour force is enormously diverse, and young people with very different class backgrounds all work together in the same venues. So, we can kind of juxtapose our participant Alex at the top, who says, basically, I was living at home already, no big deal, studying full time, my housing, all that's unaffected. Through to Felicity in Newcastle, who says, I think I had a small nervous breakdown dealing with Centrelink alone. I've never had to or been able to claim Centrelink before. I worked my way through a uni degree without government support. I understand that they were swamped, but holy shit, they could not have made that any more difficult if they had deliberately engineered it to be that difficult. So basically, she has a total financial crisis and is in big trouble, dealing with Centrelink all the time, is unable to pay her bills, things like that. So, I mean, again, we kind of know that this happened, but I think it's important to note the way that this interacts with the nature of the hospitality labour force as something which does not map onto kind of class differences. Finally, international students. International students were those who were the most likely to be off the books. And when you are off the books, of course, you do not exist. Your employer owes you nothing. And the most common narrative from our international students is that suddenly they just didn't have a job. And what's also interesting is that many of the other participants were engaged in social Facebook group chats and things in which they were constantly talking about the pandemic as, you know, the crisis started to unfold. And they all started thinking, you know, how's this going to impact on our work? And then eventually they lost shifts. And then eventually their employer said, look, sorry, you know, we'll let you know, etc. With the international students, it was, I got a text, I didn't have a job anymore. So here is a young woman saying, you know, she goes and tests, volunteers for medical testing, has drugs tested on herself in order to make money. And she said, you know, I didn't want to do it, but it's good money. I have to study. I was thinking I was home all the time. Why not, you know, give them some blood and do the same here? They pay me by the hour, you know, so there it is. So here is another person saying, again, one of the key sources of support for international students was other international students, networks of housemates and friends that basically, you know, people shared resources within their houses and things like that, the kind of deal. So here's someone saying, you know, we know how difficult it is not getting any income now from anywhere, and we're just surviving here. So we try and understand each other's thing, and we try to help each other's out if there's something. Money, they shared food, and they were, you know, enjoyed kind of being together in the household. There were also informal networks of migrants, migrant groups, which shared food and resources with international students that were part of those migrant networks. So in the 20 seconds remaining to me, I'm just going to wrap up. Basically, we know that COVID has hit precarious workers the hardest. And we, you know, we know this, and as this panel demonstrates, we're trying to understand how it is that social differences are how the impact of COVID on differently positioned young people, how that works. What is the mechanism there? And what I would kind of suggest here is one way of looking at it through the lens of employment is that we could see COVID not merely as a health crisis that impacts on precarious workers, but as a crisis of post-Fordist labour itself, a crisis that is enacted through the social and political relationships of the industry that people are working in. We see here, we see informality, informal negotiations, divisions and solidarities. We see the importance of labour force diversity, in which rather than impacting on a labour force, people are negotiating the crisis differently in ways that reflects the diversity of the labour force in relation to the employment conditions that exist there. And so I suppose to conclude, what I would suggest is that we can see the crisis as something enacted through the power relations of contemporary service employment. And we could perhaps keep this in mind going forward when thinking not only about COVID, but also about issues like precarity and social inequality in conditions of rapid social change and in conditions of crisis. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for sticking to time. That's amazing. Questions?
Can I ask a question?
Sure, and then I think we have another question from Joseph as well.
I'm just struggling with the platform. I'm not in Zoom. I'm in some other platform. I'm in the other platform that isn't Zoom. Yeah. So I'm trying to communicate with you through the other platform. Anyway, look, thanks. That was really interesting. I just had two questions. One is, how old were the participants? I'm kind of assuming between 18 and 25, but I don't think you said. And I was wondering about their engagement with Slack in relation to their age and how you kind of facilitated their engagement, whether or not they were interested in it or whether they needed a bit of encouragement. Did you give them incentives, and what exactly were they doing on Slack?
Okay, so were they interested in it? I would say they needed to be encouraged. I don't think it was clear to them what they were supposed to do, but perhaps that was our fault. We did get some interesting stuff through Slack, but I would not say that we got some interesting stuff that represented the intimacy of people's home lives and their different relationships towards their work. So people taking photos, for instance, of cocktails they were making at home to kind of keep their hand in the industry, things like that. As to how we kind of looked at that data, I don't know, Julia, Coffey, do you want to say anything else about Slack while I'm kind of floundering?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that we had research assistants and ourselves, we interacted with the participants on Slack and asked questions, and they engaged with us very readily and openly, I would say. Like not all participants used it. We asked them, I think, to make, I can't remember because it changed. This project was just constantly evolving in relation to the pandemic. But I think we asked them initially to make 3 posts across a period of a few weeks so that we could get some kind of diary entry type stuff and some photos and have a bit of interaction prior to the interview so that we could sort of talk about their Slack posts during the interviews. And that worked really well. So it was kind of like photo voice, kind of like photo elicitation, or just engage with whatever material they put in there to get some kind of sense of their experience over time. A short period of time without it being kind of too laborious for them or too, annoying. So we tried to have some like light engagement with them, but I think it worked really well. I thought it was a really good interactive participatory method that let in lots of different creative methods as well. Some of them did videos as well. It was really entirely up to them how they wanted to engage with it. And we did use incentives.
They also, some of them also wrote some nice reflective, almost diary entries just in text. Like, today it's Thursday, I'm feeling like this, X, Y, and Z. That was kind of nice as well. So
I'll post a link to the report because we talk about that data and the process and all the nitty gritty of how we did it in the report.
Yeah, I should mention we actually have a report on this project. And we have 2 journal articles, one in Young and one in Gender and Work and Organisation.
I put them in the chat. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Okay.
And I think they were 18 to 30.
Yeah, they were 18 to 30. Yeah.
I think we have a quick question from Joseph.
Thanks, David and Julia and others working on that. David, you mentioned sort of these new forms of solidarity, how they're informal. Did you see any possibility where that might be converted into something lasting beyond the crisis? I know it's sort of hard to imagine, but you also had examples there that I think referred to mutual aid activities that sort of sprung up overnight. But is there anything in the data that where you saw there was possibility there, either more formally through unions or something else?
Yeah, I don't know, but if the ARC is kind to me in the upcoming round, I will find out. Actually, we know that workers are constantly supporting one another in small ways that are really poorly understood in discussions of this form of employment, because it is taken for granted that service work is precarious and that's what matters, and that an absence of unions is definitive of the kind of structural situation that workers are in. And I think what COVID showed was that, I would obviously prefer if the labour force was fully unionised, but there are forms of support that can emerge in situations like this that are unexpected and very important for workers. In terms of what lasts afterwards, what I would say is that some of the relationships that I'm talking about here definitely pre-existed the crisis, because hospitality workplaces are often very tight-knit places. People are working with people who ideally they like, people who they regard as friends. And so in a sense, when they see a crisis of employment affecting themselves and their friends, those relationships kind of kick in a different way. In terms of afterwards, I think some of the mutual aid that you're talking about, like in terms of migrant networks and things like that, I don't know. But what happened aside from those is that after COVID, people's working situations changed dramatically, and their working relationships likely will as well. They ended up in different venues. Some of them decided to move to different industries, things like that. So it's hard to say whether those things would be lasting, but the labour force is so fluid that it would at least be, an open question. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I'm sure there are lots of other questions, but we're just going to move on to the final speaker and the final paper from Jonathan Smith from the Australian Catholic University in Brisbane, talking to us about social and political determinants of COVID-19 vaccine acceptance amongst young Queenslander. And there will be time for a couple of quick questions at the end, but we won't have time for an extended discussion, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much, Sherene. I just want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on, the Turrbal and Ura people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. So today I'm talking about hesitancy amongst young people with respect to COVID-19 vaccine, which seemed maybe a bit of a shift from the previous work that's been discussed, but I'd encourage you just to keep in mind some of the themes that have been highlighted around young people, the sort of impacts of COVID on people's optimism or lack thereof, on things like mental health and labour market position and precariousness, and just throughout this presentation, just consider how those sort of trends and impacts might impact on the types of ideas and movements that young people may be increasingly open to. And that's sort of what I'm talking about today, particularly around vaccines. I'm talking about young people and young people in Queensland in particular, who, as of currently right now, have the highest level of vaccine hesitancy in the country. And there's been a large drop in recent weeks in the rate of hesitancy as measured by a few different places, but Melbourne Institute has a hesitancy tracker, and this is one sort of indication that there is a decline here, but what's happening now as sort of borders are opening up, paradoxically the vaccine rates are increasing, but some people may be viewing this as a reason for less urgency around being vaccinated. And so that's the sort of working theory around why hesitancy may be sort of stabilizing. But particularly of importance is the trends in Queensland, which seem to be a little different. But I don't think I need to go into why getting vaccinated is important, but I think it is worth just noting that there are potentially large disadvantages that can come with not being vaccinated, and those are sort of increasing, not only in terms of the likelihood of catching and spreading COVID-19, but as things like mandates come into place, but also in terms of social relationships and people's being able to do things and go places. The longer you sort of remain unvaccinated as a young person or as anyone, the likelier you're putting yourself at risk in some respects, but also increasing potential for disadvantage. And so these sort of disadvantages aside, there are some other reasons to focus on hesitancy as a kind of like an indicator of what's happening with young people as a result of some of these trends that have been discussed in other presentations. There's importance here that goes beyond the public health implications immediately. And those are for things like the disparities around the dissemination and uptake of scientific knowledge, particularly scientific knowledge in a crisis, and how that knowledge is communicated and received. This kind of touches on some work that's been done by myself and Bruce Tranter, a colleague who worked on this paper as well, and work that's been done elsewhere on climate change. So there's some sort of parallels there around trust in science, in that case, climate scientists, but in this case, sort of medical experts and sort of chief medical officers and sources of prominent public advice on COVID-19. And what we see there and also here is a sort of skewing along partisan lines and ideological lines in the way this knowledge is sort of received and interpreted. And that's not helped by, you know, some miscommunication, you know, instances of sort of poor or mixed messages that have been sent around vaccines. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in detail for Queensland. But other reasons why this is important and other literatures that this sort of touches on are around the challenges of misinformation and what's become known as this sort of term, the COVID epidemic, which sort of gets at this idea of this sort of barrage of information, the public that's been put out there into the public domain, and not all of it accurate, not all of it, you know, and some of it sort of disinformation. There's a question of the overlap that hesitancy has with pre-pandemic sort of movements. For instance, most notably the anti-vaccination movement. We've had great work on this in Australia by Naomi Smith, who I'm not sure if she's here, but many of you know her, and Tim Graham. So I'll sort of look at that a little bit, and also looking at the potential for other movement to sort of converge around the idea of vaccine resistance and opposition, which we've seen in sort of recent weeks, really, but going back a little while. You know, we have the far right, white supremacists, anti-lockdown movement, and you know, conspiracy movements, you know, too numerous to name. And there's this sense that there's a potential for radicalization of people who may have just been hesitant. And so there's a question of the trend and where this goes. So all of this sort of summed up to a need for some focus on social and political bases of hesitancy, and the need to kind of distinguish a bit from hesitancy and just being slow to act and maybe some of those barriers, to resistance and kind of a deeper seated opposition. And then there's also this question about what's different now in the pandemic around vaccine, operating on vaccine beliefs as opposed to previously. So with that in mind, we look to answer this question of what are the political and social bases of COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy and resistance. So I sort of changed the topic a little bit since the abstract. Amongst young Queenslanders. So we want to kind of get a few sub-questions there around, you know, what's different with COVID hesitancy and resistance compared to sort of general anti-vaccination sort of beliefs. And also, you know, what are the sort of other pandemic-related value changes that might kind of help understand this? Things like belief in authoritarian sort of actions being necessary. You know, trust in medical experts, some examples. And we use the Our Lives data, which is a study that's been mentioned, the other one that Brady and Steve were involved on. And in this case, this is using Our Lives data from, it's a cohort study that began when participants were around 12 years old. They're now in wave 8, so they're kind of like long-term participants in the study, and it's still underway. So this is all sort of preliminary and interim data. From about half of what we expect to get in our main sample. But for timeliness, we wanted to just sort of start analysing it now. It's being a long-term study. It's not exactly what I would call representative, but it is very diverse. It is though skewed towards more towards participation by women, tertiary educated young people, and probably more towards the southeast Queensland base of the state. And you know, I'd have to speculate, I guess, that these are things that are probably likely to sort of potentially underrepresent the true degree of vaccine hesitancy. So it's sort of like a, you know, best case scenario that when we get at some of that stuff. Just to give a sense of the timeline of this work, you know, this is the year it's been a bit of a blur, but in Queensland, you know, we see some of the milestones there and looking at this through the lens of young people. The rollout began earlier in the year, and then shortly after we started seeing some cases of AstraZeneca flooding, and these started to sort of translate into some changing of guidance around vaccine suitability and age eligibility. It was around June where we started to see some changing of those guidelines at the national level. And late June, where we then saw the shortages in Pfizer and a shift in the recommendation for under 40 to be eligible to request AstraZeneca at a GP. But very shortly afterwards in Queensland, we had our Chief Health Officer basically come out and say that it's not advisable for young Queenslanders to get AstraZeneca. And so there are these sort of mixed messages leading into this work. And then we also had here in Queensland, Brisbane in particular, the largest of outbreak of Delta strain and a lockdown there. And not long after that lifted, then our fieldwork began in August, and the interim data sort of collected data for about a month there. And during that time is when young people became fully eligible to access Pfizer. So the vaccine rates were sort of at the start of the fieldwork, they're around sort of 47% for Queensland as a whole with first dose, and it sort of rose to about 63%. But that was higher in Brisbane, where this sample is probably based, and a little lower for young people in the age group of the sample, which I should mention is 28 years old. Everyone's roughly around that age in this sample. So here we just see the overall distribution of likeliness to receive a COVID vaccine, and we'll see that, like, consistent with what's going on at that timeline, around 56% of the sample were already received one dose of that vaccine. And around another quarter were very likely to receive it. And so for the purposes of classifying, I guess, the hesitancy and resistance, it's the very unlikely group. So not at all likely, not very likely, and somewhat likely, who in our analysis we kind of treat as resistant. And that's in some senses relative to the distribution overall. You can see this very, very kind of low levels and around 111 people in our sample. And here is what we treat as sort of unvaccinated versus vaccinated. Actually, next graph sort of breaks it down a bit. So we're getting there we go. So we had around 44% of the sample who were sort of hesitant. But then around 13% of the sample who were what we would kind of classify a little bit more resistant. And then just breaking this down purely by political party, there was significant, statistically significant differences here. And those were broken down on the lines of Conservative or no party being much higher hesitancy and much higher. And so Greens and Labor supporters were much likelier to be vaccinated, but also less likely to be resistant or hesitant. And then some of those sort of COVID-related values, the perceived risk of COVID was generally, we had a statement there that the risk of COVID is greatly exaggerated. Most people disagreed with that, but there are sort of lower levels of belief in that. And then also authoritarianism, this idea that people's freedom needs to be restricted sometimes. Generally, there was a higher level of agreement with that. And then on some of the other related sort of beliefs around trust, a very high level of trust in medical experts. And sort of this anti-vaccination scale that we created out of questions around vaccines that are unrelated to COVID specifically. So the notion, for instance, childhood vaccines are effective, the quality of the data behind vaccines, and concern about effects of adverse effects. You see there sort of a distribution of around most people having no or very little anti-vaccine beliefs, but then at the upper end of the spectrum, some people with strong anti-vaccine beliefs. So just to get to the main part of the analysis here before I wrap up, and this is probably a little bit more complex than it needs to be, but I wanted to focus on the predictors of each of these three kind of variables. First being whether you're just whether you're not vaccinated yet at this point in time, which is, everyone's actually able to access the vaccine. That's hesitancy, resistance, which is that you're unvaccinated and also unlikely to get vaccinated. And then lastly, anti-vaccine beliefs. And I'll draw your attention just to the sort of the solid shaded line, which indicates statistically significant effects. Ignore those sort of striped lines for now. So what we can see is that there are sort of strong educational disparities going on, particularly for hesitancy and anti-vaccine beliefs. And so people who are just not university educated were much likelier to be in either of these categories. For hesitancy, what emerged once controlling for everything that we've mentioned, all these sort of covariates around education, religion, relationships, politics. What emerged was a low level of generalized social trust predicted being unvaccinated at this point in time, and so potentially a little hesitant. And also this measure of populism, which was a kind of a measure of whether just alienation from politics and the idea that people should control decisions rather than politicians. Politicians were corrupt. And so those were the main things, independent of these COVID-related sort of measures around distrust and rejection of COVID as a threat. And those two measures across the board predicted hesitancy, even more so they predicted resistance and also anti-vaccine beliefs. So then in the question, in terms of hesitancy, the additional sort of characteristic that people who were, resistant were things like being from identifying with other Christian religion, which is something like being Baptist or a sort of a more conservative religion, and having high psychological distress, and also not identifying with any party. And the shaded, these striped sort of lines here are basically just effects that were there before we put these COVID-19 perceptions into the model. And we see that those basically, there were educational differences similar to the other variables, the other outcomes, but they were fully explained by distrust in medical experts. So basically that these account for those educational differences. And the one thing that stands out with the particularly resistant group is the additional belief in rejecting authoritarianism. And that is something that neither stood out for the hesitant or people with anti-vaccine beliefs. We did ask a bit more about the reason behind this, but we're going to explore this more qualitatively. And I won't sort of get into that.
Hey, Jonathan.
Yes.
Sorry, just conscious of the time.
Okay, sure.
If you're happy to just wrap up, we can squeeze in one quick question.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah. I just want to say basically that there is a very important need to differentiate between hesitancy and resistance and general anti-vax beliefs. All of these do involve those things around distrust and rejecting COVID as a threat and educational disparities. Hesitancy, though, seems to be more shaped by weaker social ties and potential disengagement or switching off from politics, whereas resistance was more, there was this tendency to reject authoritarian values as something that stood out. There was shared bases between anti-vaccine beliefs and particularly resistance to COVID-19. Which is sort of a concern in the sense that there is that potential for radicalization there if people are sort of latching onto COVID-19 resistance and opposition to sort of push other ideological agendas. So I'll leave it there anyway. Sorry for going over a bit. Yes.
That's okay. Does anybody have a quick question for Jonathan? It was such fascinating data, as Anna mentions in the chat, and there's so much to unpack. I can see Dave's going to stand up, so I'll just let you go, Dave.
Thanks, Jonathan. Very interesting. So yeah, obviously you've got a lot to untangle here. One of the things that interests me is what your discussion about, so you've got this no party category and your discussion about political affiliations. And I think part of what you've shown is really just evocative of the broader kind of politics of COVID that we've seen in general in Australia. But it seems to me like, what we're seeing here is a kind of a shift in the way that politics takes place away from ideology and onto contestations of knowledge. And what counts as knowledge has become a political marker. So, you either trust medical experts and things, and then you're a cosmopolitan progressive, or you distrust authority and you're a classic conservative, or you're no party, right? And they're interesting because they're rejecting, it seems to me, both of those things. And I mean, like the non-sociologist in me wants to call them nutters, but they are, a growing and very significant kind of cohort of people. And I wonder if you had anything more to say about, have you kind of reflected on what this means for the way that political divisions are actually being enacted? It makes me think about, these ideas that we're in a kind of post-ideological kind of world, but then these contestations of knowledge. And if you have anything else to say about the kind of no party category, right, and what that can tell us about these kinds of contestations.
I do. Thank you. That's a really excellent question. And we've done a little work to sort of explore who the no party category is in another previous paper that we've got out there, Bruce, Tranter and I. And the reality is it's a very large, it's around a third of the sample. And looking at even other surveys like the Australian Election Study, for instance, it's large and it's sort of steadily increasing as well. So I mean that's one point to make, is just that this tendency to identify with rejection of not only knowledge around climate around COVID, but also on other issues that are sort of science driven, I guess, or that have a tendency to be based in people's understanding of science. They are where there's a kind of alignment between this partisan and non-partisan sort of divide in politics can kind of potentially expand. So this is ripe territory for people to sort of become less engaged with science as well as politics. And so I think we explored, well, who are these no party people? What do they identify with? And in that paper, we couldn't actually find much at all. They were distrustful of most institutions, more so than people who had a partisan attachment. They were less likely to sort of be socially engaged and socially active. We were exploring affiliations across all of our measures and we couldn't find much. And there was just this sort of narrower kind of social universe there. And that is where there's this real risk and potential vulnerability for radicalization, exposure, the appeal of some of these ideas and movements. So I mean, it's something that it's sort of it's really important. And just going back to young people, in this instance, it's really shaping what the next few years is going to look like for these people who are in, especially in the resistant kind of category. But what if that sort of grows, particularly if people with no affiliation and alienated are kind of increasing? It's a bit of a concern, I think.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll have to wrap up here. If you have any other questions for Jonathan or any of the speakers that we didn't get to today, I'm sure they're happy to receive emails. Thank you, everybody who was part of the panel. Thanks to all the speakers. Thanks, Brady, for initially putting this together, and for everyone who attended and asked questions. It was really engaging. I've certainly learned a lot, and I think there's a lot of generative research going on in this space that is just going to be really exciting to watch over the next few years. that's the end of our panel, but like I said, there are other great sessions going on at TASA and a couple of presentations specifically in the Sociology of Youth stream that's happening tomorrow. And that's about it from me. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sherene. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, friends.